Hello, and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. On November 20th, 1910, in a modest station master's house at Astapovo, a remote railway junction in central Russia, an old man lay dying. He was 82 years old, his beard long and white, his body wasted by pneumonia. Outside, reporters from around the world gathered in the cold, their cameras ready, their telegraph wires humming with bulletins. Inside, the old man drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring words that no one could quite make out. This was not how he had planned it. He had fled his own home in the middle of the night 10 days earlier, escaping from a life that had become unbearable, seeking some final peace before death found him. But peace had eluded him even at the end. The world's eyes were upon him. His wife from whom he had fled was in a nearby train car, forbidden to see him. His followers clustered around his bed, recording his final words. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had excommunicated him 9 years earlier, watched from a distance, waiting to see if the great heretic would repent before the end. He did not repent. On the morning of November the 20th, Count Leo Tolstoy, author of War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, Christian anarchist, vegetarian, spiritual seeker, aristocrat who had renounced his wealth, died as he had lived for the past 30 years of his life, in defiance of convention, pursuing a truth that only he could see clearly, leaving behind a legacy so vast and contradictory that the world is still trying to make sense of it more than a century later. Consider the strangeness of what I have just described. Here was a man born into the highest ranks of Russian nobility, a count who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of serfs, who ended his life fleeing from his own home in the middle of the night like a peasant escaping from bondage. Here was a man who wrote two of the greatest novels in human literature, who created characters so real they seem more alive than most people we actually know, yet who spent the last 3 decades of his life claiming that all art, including his own, was essentially worthless. Here was a man who preached absolute poverty and simple living, yet could not bring himself to actually give away his possessions. Here was a Christian who rejected the church, a pacifist who had served in the army, a moral philosopher who could not live according to his own philosophy. The contradictions pile up until they become almost absurd. And yet this deeply flawed, endlessly searching, perpetually tormented man produced work of such profound insight into the human condition that his books remain essential reading nearly 150 years after they were written. Every time someone opens War and Peace and discovers that a 1,200-page Russian novel is somehow the most engaging thing they have ever read, Leo Tolstoy's influence continues. Every time someone struggles with questions of how to live a good life, how to find meaning, how to reconcile ideals with reality, they are walking a path that Tolstoy spent his entire life exploring. But to understand how this happened, how a Russian count became one of the most influential writers and thinkers in human history, we must go back to the beginning, to a world of country estates and serf labour, of French tutors and orthodox traditions, to a place called Yasnaya Polyana, where on a late summer day in 1828, a child was born who would change literature forever. Before we begin this journey through one of the most remarkable lives in literary history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear in the comments which of Tolstoy's works has most affected you, or whether you have struggled, as so many do, with the question of how to live a meaningful life. And now, settle in. Let the concerns of the day fade away as we travel back to Imperial Russia, to an era of vast estates and rigid hierarchies, where a family of ancient nobility prepared to welcome their youngest son. The world of Imperial Russia, the Russia into which Leo Tolstoy was born in 1828, was an empire of staggering contradictions. It stretched from Poland in the west to Alaska in the east, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups, multiple religions, and a population of more than 60 million people. At its head sat Tsar Nicholas I, an autocrat who ruled with absolute authority, backed by a vast bureaucracy, a powerful military, and the weight of orthodox tradition. Russian society in 1828 was feudal in everything but name. At the very top stood the Tsar and the Imperial family, surrounded by the highest nobility, families whose titles stretched back centuries, who owned entire provinces. Below them came the provincial nobility, the gentry who owned country estates and lived off the labour of serfs. These were the Tolstoy's people, aristocrats of ancient lineage but relatively modest means by the standards of the highest families. Then came the merchants, the clergy, the small class of professionals and intellectuals, groups that were growing but still tiny compared to the vast majority of Russia's population, and that vast majority, perhaps 90% of all Russians, were peasants. Most were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked, owned by the nobles whose estates they lived on. They could not leave without permission. They could be bought and sold, though usually not separated from the land. They had few legal rights. In everything but name, they were slaves. This was the fundamental reality of Russian life in 1828. A tiny elite living in European-style luxury, speaking French more often than Russian, educated by foreign tutors, wearing imported clothes and reading imported books, all supported by the forced labour of millions of peasants who lived in conditions that had barely changed since the Middle Ages. The contradiction between European Enlightenment and medieval bondage defined Russian culture. How could an educated man read Voltaire and Rousseau, absorb ideas of liberty and equality, and then return to an estate worked by people he owned? The question tormented the best minds of Tolstoy's generation. Some became revolutionaries, some became reformers, some retreated into cynicism or vodka, and some, like Tolstoy himself, spent their entire lives searching for an answer that would reconcile their ideals with their reality. Into this world of profound moral contradictions, on August 28, 1828, by the old Julian calendar still in use in Russia, at the family estate of Yasnaya Polyana in Tula province, about 120 miles south of Moscow, Leo Nikolaevich Tolstoy was born. The Tolstoy family. The Tolstoys were old nobility, ancient even by Russian standards. The family traced its lineage back to a 14th century nobleman named Indris, who'd come to Russia from the east and entered the service of the Grand Prince of Moscow. Over the centuries, the Tolstoys had produced military officers, diplomats, and court officials. They had never been among the richest or most powerful families, but their lineage was impeccable. Leo's father was Count Nikolai Ilyich Tolstoy, a kind-hearted but not particularly distinguished man who had served in the army during the Napoleonic Wars. He had been captured by the French in 1812, held prisoner, and released after Napoleon's defeat. The experience left him with no great love for military life. After the war, he retired to manage the family estates, a decent landlord by the standards of the time, neither cruel nor particularly progressive. Nikolai's financial situation was not strong. The Tolstoy estates were substantial in size but burdened with debt. Like many Russian nobles, Nikolai lived beyond his means, maintaining the lifestyle expected of his rank even as his actual income barely supported it. He needed to marry well, to find a wife who would bring enough money to shore up the family finances. In 1822, Nikolai married Princess Maria Nikolaevna Volkonsky, a woman from one of Russia's most distinguished families. The Volkonskys were far more prominent than the Tolstoys, connected to the imperial court, wealthy in their own right. Maria brought a substantial dowry to the marriage, including the estate of Yasnaya Polyana, which would become the Tolstoy family seat for the next century. Maria was 32 when she married, considered quite old for a bride in that era. She was not beautiful by contemporary accounts, but she was intelligent, well-educated, and cultured. She spoke several languages fluently, played the piano, and had been raised in the sophisticated atmosphere of her family's Moscow mansion. She was also deeply religious, devoted to orthodox practice and to charitable works among the peasants. The marriage appears to have been reasonably happy, at least by the standards of arranged marriages among the nobility. Nikolai and Maria had 5 children who survived infancy. Nikolai, born in 1823, Sergei, born in 1826, Dmitri, born in 1827, Leo, born in 1828, and a daughter, Maria, born in 1830. Leo Nikolaevich Tolstoy was the 4th of 5 children, the baby boy before his sister arrived. He was named for his maternal grandfather, but the name would be shortened to Leova in the family, a diminutive that his siblings and later his own children would use throughout his life. The household at Yasnaya Polyana was large and complex, as all noble estates were. The main house was a sprawling white wooden structure with multiple wings, surrounded by gardens, orchards, and birch groves. Beyond the immediate grounds stretched fields worked by the estate's serfs, several hundred people who lived in the village attached to the estate, who owed their labour to the Tolstoy family, and who constituted both the source of the family's income and the moral burden that would haunt Leo for his entire life. Inside the house lived not just the family, but tutors, governesses, distant relatives, and trusted servants who occupied an ambiguous position between family members and staff. French was spoken more than Russian. The day followed European patterns. The children were raised by nurses and tutors, seeing their parents at appointed times rather than living in constant contact. Yet this household was also marked from the beginning by an undercurrent of tragedy that would shape young Leo's understanding of life as fundamentally uncertain, and loss as inevitable. Early childhood and loss. Leo Tolstoy's earliest memories were of Yasnaya Polyana, the estate that would remain the centre of his life even when he tried to escape it. He remembered the birch groves where he played with his brothers. He remembered the pond where they skated in winter. He remembered the peasant children from the village, who were playmates when young but who would drift away as everyone got older and social distinctions hardened. His mother was a gentle presence in these early memories, though distant in the way that noble mothers of that era were distant from their children, involved in their upbringing but not in the hour-by-hour care. That was left to nurses and servants. But Maria Tolstoy paid attention to her children's education and moral development, keeping notebooks about their progress, worrying over their characters. In 1830, when Leo was not yet 2 years old, his mother gave birth to their sister Maria. And then, catastrophically, when Leo was barely 2 years old, his mother died. The exact cause of death is unclear from historical records, but it may have been related to complications from childbirth or an infection contracted shortly after. She was 38 years old. Leo Tolstoy had no conscious memory of his mother. She died before he was old enough to form lasting memories of her face or voice. Yet her absence shaped him profoundly. For the rest of his life he would carry an idealized image of a mother he had never known, a figure of perfect love and moral purity. He would search for that unconditional acceptance in every relationship, and he would never quite find it. The household continued, held together by relatives and servants. Nikolai's unmarried cousin, Tatiana Alexandrovna Yergolskaya, called Antoinette, moved in to help raise the children. She was a warm, loving presence who tried to fill the void left by the children's mother. The older boys, Nikolai and Sergei, were already past the age where a mother's death would devastate them completely. But Dmitri, Maria, and especially Leo, grew up in a household marked by absence, by the missing figure at its centre. Their father tried to carry on. He managed the estates. He maintained the household. He was not an unkind man, but he was not equipped to be both father and mother to 5 young children. He relied on Antoinette, on tutors, on the structure of noble life to raise his children while he handled the practical matters of running an estate, perpetually on the edge of financial crisis. The children formed their own small world. Nikolai, the eldest, was Leo's first hero, a boy with a wild imagination who invented games and stories. One of Nikolai's stories would haunt Leo for the rest of his life, the tale of the green stick buried somewhere on the estate, which held the secret of how to make all people happy and loving. They searched for this stick in the birch groves, knowing even as children that it was imaginary but hoping nonetheless that it might be real. The boys played at being knights, at being soldiers, at being explorers. They created elaborate fantasy worlds. They read avidly everything they could get their hands on, Russian fairy tales, French novels, whatever books the house contained. They were raised to speak French as fluently as Russian, to regard French culture as superior, to see themselves as Europeans who happen to live in Russia rather than as Russians proper. This childhood at Yasnaya Polyana was in many ways idyllic, the kind of pastoral aristocratic childhood that would later seem impossibly distant from the realities of urban life and industrial progress. Long summers, winters with sleigh rides and skating, freedom to roam the estate, the affection of Antoinette, the companionship of siblings, the security of belonging to an ancient family with an assured place in the social order. But beneath this surface ran deeper currents, the knowledge that their mother was gone, the financial anxieties that occasionally erupted into adult conversations the children overheard, and the inescapable fact of the serfs, the hundreds of people who worked the land, who bowed when the family passed, who lived in conditions that even a child could see were harsh. Leo was a sensitive child, prone to tears, easily wounded by criticism, desperate for approval. He was not as handsome as his older brothers. He had thick lips, a broad nose, ears that stuck out. He was acutely conscious of his appearance, already at 5 or 6 years old developing the painful self-consciousness that would plague him through adolescence. In 1837, when Leo was 9 years old, his father decided the family needed to winter in Moscow so that the older boys could receive better education and begin to be introduced into society. They left Yasnaya Polyana for a rented house in Moscow. It was Leo's first real experience of city life, of the broader world beyond the estate. And then disaster struck again. In June of 1837, just a few months after the move to Moscow, Nikolai Tolstoy died suddenly. He had been in good health. He went out for a walk one day and collapsed on the street. He was carried home and died within hours, possibly from a stroke or heart attack. He was 44 years old. Leo Tolstoy, at 9 years old, had now lost both parents. He had no memory of his mother and only fragmentary memories of his father. He was an orphan, and he would remain an orphan in his heart for the rest of his life, searching for something that had been taken from him before he was old enough to know what it was. The orphaned years after their father's death, the 5 Tolstoy children became legal wards. Their father's will had appointed several guardians. Antoinette, who had no legal authority as a woman, but who remained the emotional centre of the children's lives, and Count Alexei Ostensakin, a distant relative who became their official guardian. The family returned to Yasnaya Polyana, but the estate itself was in legal limbo. Nikolai Tolstoy had died in debt. The estates had to be managed by the guardians until the children came of age. The older boys, Nikolai and Sergei, were already approaching the age where they would enter military or civil service. Dmitri, Maria, and Leo were still children, dependent on the adults around them. In 1840, when Leo was 11, their guardian Count Ostensakin died. The legal arrangements had to be redone. the children's care was transferred to another relative, their father's sister Alexandra Osten-Sarkin, who lived in the city of Kazan, about 450 miles east of Moscow. This meant uprooting the children once again. They left Yasnaya Polyana, left Antoinette, who was too old to travel, and moved to Kazan to live with an aunt they barely knew. It was a jarring transition. Kazan was a provincial city, neither Moscow's sophistication nor Yasnaya Polyana's pastoral charm. Their Aunt Alexandra was devout to the point of severity, concerned primarily with religious observance and social propriety. For Leo, now entering adolescence, it was a difficult period. He was acutely self-conscious about his appearance, painfully aware that he was not handsome like his brothers. He was introspective, given to long bouts of self-analysis and self-criticism. He kept a diary, beginning the habit of obsessive self-examination that would continue for the next 60 years. He was educated by tutors, as all noble children were. He studied languages, French, German, English. He studied mathematics, history, geography. But he was not a particularly dedicated student. He was easily bored, easily distracted, prone to grand enthusiasms that faded quickly. What he loved was reading. He devoured books. Rousseau's Confessions affected him deeply. The idea that a person could bare their soul completely, confess every shameful thought and action, and through that honesty achieve some kind of moral purification. He read Voltaire, Diderot, the French philosophers whose ideas about reason and nature and the corruption of civilization would influence his thinking for life. He also discovered, as adolescent boys do, the confusing and overwhelming reality of sexual desire. For a boy raised in an atmosphere of strict propriety, these feelings were deeply shameful. He began visiting prostitutes, an activity that was common among young men of his class, but which filled him with self-loathing afterward. The pattern was established early. Desire, indulgence, shame, resolution to change, and then the cycle beginning again. In 1843, when Leo was 15, his Aunt Alexandra died. The children were orphaned yet again, their third parental figure lost. Another relative, Pelageya Yushkov, took over their guardianship. Pelageya was a different sort of guardian, more interested in society and matchmaking than in moral education. She lived in Kazan and immediately set about trying to introduce the older Tolstoy boys into provincial society. For Leo, this meant balls, social gatherings, attempts at flirtation with young women from good families. He was terrible at it. He was awkward, overly intense, too honest in a world that ran on polite lies. He would fall desperately in love with young women he barely knew, write passionate entries in his diary about them, and then be crushed when they showed no interest in return. He developed elaborate theories about how to improve himself, how to become the kind of man he wanted to be. He drew up rules for his conduct, vowed to follow strict schedules, to study systematically, to control his base desires. He broke these rules almost immediately and then flagellated himself in his diary for his weakness. In 1844, at age 16, Leo Tolstoy enrolled at Kazan University. It was expected that young men of good family would attend university, either in Moscow or St. Petersburg if they were wealthy enough, or at provincial universities like Kazan if they were not. Tolstoy began in the Department of Oriental Languages, thinking he might pursue a career in diplomacy. He hated it. The lectures were dull, the professors were pedantic, the other students seemed frivolous and stupid. He skipped classes. He spent his time reading books that interested him rather than studying what was assigned. He was brilliant when something caught his attention, but he could not force himself to care about subjects that bored him. After a year, he switched to the law faculty, thinking that might suit him better. It did not. He continued his pattern of sporadic attendance, intense private reading, and increasing dissatisfaction with formal education. His true education was happening in his diary, in his endless self-analysis, in his reading of philosophers and novelists, in his observations of society, and his increasingly critical view of the world around him. He was searching for something, some key to understanding how to live rightly. He read Rousseau and became convinced that civilization corrupted natural goodness. He read religious texts and became convinced that organized religion was hypocritical. He observed the wealthy families of Kazan and became convinced that high society was empty and false. He looked at his own desires and weaknesses and became convinced that he was fundamentally flawed. Everything contradicted everything else. How could he believe in natural goodness while hating his own nature? How could he criticize society while desperately wanting its approval? How could he seek truth while constantly lying to himself in his diary? These contradictions, which would have paralyzed a lesser mind, became the driving force of Tolstoy's intellectual life. He could not rest in certainty. He could not accept comfortable lies. He had to keep questioning, keep pushing, keep tearing down his own conclusions to see what lay beneath. In 1847, when he was 19 years old and had been at the university for 3 years without much progress toward a degree, Tolstoy made a decision. He would leave the university. He would return to Yasnaya Polyana, which had now passed to him as his portion of the family inheritance. He would become a model landlord, improve the lives of his serfs, manage his estate rationally and progressively, and somehow reconcile his ideals with his reality. It was a beautiful plan. It would fail completely, as almost all of Tolstoy's plans would fail. But the failure would teach him more than success ever could have. The Young Landlord. In the spring of 1847, Leo Tolstoy returned to Yasnaya Polyana as its owner. He was 19 years old, full of ideas, determined to be different from other landlords, convinced that he could improve the lives of his serfs while also improving the productivity of his estate. He'd been reading about agricultural reform. He knew about new farming methods being tried in Western Europe. He had ideas about education, about treating the serfs more humanely, about creating a model community that would demonstrate how landowners and peasants could live in a more just relationship. The serfs were skeptical. They had seen young masters come and go, full of enthusiasm that faded quickly. They knew that gentlemen talked a great deal and did very little. They listened politely to Tolstoy's proposals and then continued farming the way they had always farmed. Tolstoy tried to build a school for the peasant children. Few came. The parents needed their children to work in the fields. Education seemed like a luxury or a trick, something that would benefit the master more than them. Tolstoy tried to introduce new crops and new methods. The peasants resisted, knowing that experiments with their livelihoods could mean starvation if the new methods failed. Tolstoy discovered what every idealistic reformer discovers, that changing systems is much harder than imagining change. The serfs did not trust him. Why should they? He owned them. He could have them flogged if they disobeyed. His kind words and progressive ideas meant nothing compared to the fundamental reality of their bondage. And Tolstoy himself was not ready for the discipline that real reform required. He would start projects with great enthusiasm and then abandon them when they became tedious. He would draw up elaborate plans and then disappear to Moscow for months, leaving the estate to be run by managers. In Moscow, he fell into the life of a young nobleman with money and time to waste. He gambled, often losing more than he could afford. He frequented brothels, engaging in the sexual license that was expected of young men of his class while despising himself for it afterward. He attempted to enter society, attending balls and salons, but his awkwardness and intensity made him a poor fit for the superficial social games that others played so easily. He continued his obsessive diary-keeping, recording every failure, every moral lapse, every resolution to change. The diary became a kind of mirror in which he could see himself with cruel clarity, cataloguing his faults in exhaustive detail. He developed a system of marks for grading his behavior each day. He created rules for himself. No gambling, no women, no wasting time. He broke these rules constantly, and then wrote pages analyzing why he had broken them. In 1848, revolutions swept across Europe. Monarchies fell. Republics were declared. The old order seemed to be crumbling. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas I responded with increased repression, terrified that revolutionary ideas would spread to his empire. The intelligentsia watched nervously, wondering whether Russia's turn would come. Tolstoy watched with interest, but from a distance. He was not politically engaged. His concerns were more personal, more moral. How should a person live? What gave life meaning? What was the relationship between the individual and society? He continued his pattern of oscillating between Yasnaya Polyana and the cities, between rural reform projects and urban dissipation, between high ideals and base behavior. He was acutely aware of his own hypocrisy, but seemed unable to escape it. He wanted to be good, but kept doing things he knew were wrong. He wanted to live simply, but craved luxury and comfort. He wanted to help the peasants, but could not bring himself to fundamentally change the system that oppressed them. By 1849, Tolstoy was 21 years old and thoroughly dissatisfied with himself. He had accomplished nothing. His reforms at Yasnaya Polyana had failed. His social life was empty. His relationships with women were sordid and shameful. His gambling debts were mounting. He was drifting through life without purpose or direction. What he needed was something that would force him to change, some experience dramatic enough to shake him out of his comfortable patterns. In 1851, his brother Nikolai, who was serving as an officer in the Caucasus, invited Leo to come visit. The Caucasus was Russia's wild frontier, a region of mountains and fierce tribes that had been resisting Russian conquest for decades. It was a place where a man could test himself, find adventure, perhaps discover who he really was beneath all the self-deception. Tolstoy accepted the invitation. He had no idea that this decision would change the entire course of his life. The Caucasus. In the spring of 1851, Leo Tolstoy travelled south from Yasnaya Polyana toward the Caucasus, that wild mountain region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, where Russia had been fighting a brutal colonial war for decades. The journey itself took weeks, travelling by post-coach and carriage across the vast Russian landscape, through the black earth regions of the south, past Cossack settlements, toward the mountain ranges that mark the frontier. As he travelled, Tolstoy felt something lifting from him, some weight that city life and failed rural projects had imposed. The farther he got from civilization, the freer he felt. His brother Nikolai was stationed at a Cossack settlement on the Terek River in what is now the border region between Russia and Chechnya. The landscape was dramatic. Snow-capped mountains visible in the distance, dense forests along the river, vast steppes stretching to the horizon. The Cossacks who lived there were frontier people, rough and vital, very different from the affected aristocrats of Moscow or St. Petersburg. The war in the Caucasus was grinding and brutal. Russia was trying to subdue the mountain peoples, Chechens, Circassians, Dagestanis, who'd been fighting for their independence under the leadership of Imam Shamil, a religious and military leader of extraordinary ability. It was guerrilla warfare, ambushes and raids, villages burned, prisoners taken, a cycle of violence that had been going on for years with no end in sight. Tolstoy was not officially enlisted in the army, but he accompanied his brother's unit on expeditions, experiencing combat for the first time. He showed remarkable courage under fire, a coolness in battle that surprised him. He had always thought of himself as a coward, but when bullets were flying, he found that he could keep his head, could observe what was happening with an almost detached clarity. He was also appalled by the war. He saw villages destroyed, saw the bodies of dead mountaineers left in the sun, saw Russian soldiers brutalized by the endless violence. He began to question the entire enterprise. What right did Russia have to these lands? What justified the suffering being inflicted on people who simply wanted to be left alone? But alongside the horror was an undeniable exhilaration. The landscape was beautiful. The simple life of the military camp, the clear hierarchy, the defined purpose, all of it was a relief from the endless self-questioning of civilian life. And there was something intoxicating about the proximity to death, the way it made every moment feel more real. During his time in the Caucasus, Tolstoy began writing seriously. Not just diary entries, but actual literary work. He started a novel called Childhood, a semi-autobiographical work about a young boy's memories and feelings. The writing came easily, pouring out of him with a fluency he had never experienced before. It was as if the distance from his normal life, the simplicity of the military routine, and the intensity of the war had unlocked something in him. He wrote every day when he was not on campaign. He filled notebooks with drafts and revisions. He discovered that writing gave him something that nothing else in his life had given him, a sense of purpose, a feeling that he was doing something worthwhile, a way of making sense of his experiences and observations. In July 1852, Tolstoy sent the manuscript of Childhood to the Contemporary, the most prestigious literary magazine in Russia. He expected nothing. He was an unknown 23-year-old officer writing from the Caucasus. Why would they publish him? To his astonishment, the Contemporary not only accepted Childhood, but published it in September 1852 with high praise. The editor, Nikolai Nekrasov, one of Russia's leading literary figures, wrote to Tolstoy that he had real talent. Other writers noticed the new work. Critics praised its psychological insight, its honest portrayal of a child's inner life. Tolstoy was suddenly a published author, someone with literary credentials, not just another dilettante nobleman who dabbled in writing. The validation was intoxicating. If he could do this, if he could write and be recognized for it, then perhaps his life could have meaning after all. Encouraged, he continued writing. He worked on Boyhood, a sequel to Childhood. He began military sketches, stories based on his experiences in the Caucasus. He was developing his voice, learning how to capture psychological states with precision, how to render scenes with vivid detail, how to create characters who felt like real people rather than literary types. At the same time, he decided to formalize his military service. In 1852, he officially enlisted as a cadet in the artillery, starting at the bottom of the officer hierarchy. He would have to pass exams, prove himself, work his way up. It was humbling for a count to serve alongside commoners, but Tolstoy found something appealing in the structure and discipline of military life. The war continued. Tolstoy participated in campaigns, experienced more combat, continued his observations of the gap between the official version of military glory and the grim reality of war. He was gathering material, both consciously and unconsciously, that would later find its way into War and Peace. In 1853, Russia went to war with Turkey, a conflict that would expand into the Crimean War when Britain and France joined Turkey against Russia. Tolstoy requested a transfer to the Danube front, wanting to see more action, still testing himself, still searching for something he could not quite name. By 1854, the war was going badly for Russia. Modern Western armies with rifles and artillery were devastating Russian forces equipped with outdated weapons and led by incompetent generals. Tolstoy transferred again, this time to Sevastopol, the great naval fortress in Crimea that was under siege by British and French forces. Sevastopol would become the crucible in which Tolstoy's mature understanding of war was forged. Sevastopol, the Siege of Sevastopol, lasted from October 1854 to September 1855, nearly a year of continuous bombardment, assault, and defence. The city and its fortress were subjected to some of the most intensive artillery bombardment the world had yet seen. Thousands of soldiers on both sides died in trenches, in underground tunnels, in desperate charges across open ground. Lieutenant Tolstoy arrived in Sevastopol in November 1854 and was assigned to an artillery unit in the 4th Bastion, one of the most exposed and dangerous positions in the defensive line. The 4th Bastion was under constant fire. Shells fell day and night. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of death. Tolstoy served there for months, experiencing the full horror of modern warfare. He saw men blown apart by artillery shells. He saw soldiers driven mad by the constant bombardment. He saw officers who sent men to die from positions of safety. He saw incredible courage and equally incredible cruelty and waste. And he continued to write. In bunkers between bombardments, by candlelight in his quarters, Tolstoy worked on what would become the Sevastopol Sketches, a series of stories that portrayed the siege with unprecedented realism. He did not glorify war. He did not hide its ugliness. He showed soldiers as they really were, brave and cowardly, noble and petty, often confused about what they were fighting for. The Sevastopol Sketches were published in the Contemporary throughout 1855 and caused a sensation. Here was writing about war that felt true, that captured the chaos and absurdity alongside the heroism. Tolstoy was becoming famous, known throughout Russia as the officer who could write about war with an authenticity that no one had achieved before. The siege ended in September 1855 when Russian forces abandoned Sevastopol after nearly a year of defence. Russia had lost the Crimean War, a humiliating defeat that exposed the empire's backwardness and incompetence. The loss would trigger reforms, including the eventual abolition of serfdom. Tolstoy survived the war with his literary reputation enhanced, but his view of military glory shattered. He had seen too much waste, too much suffering inflicted for dubious purposes by men who did not understand or care about the human cost. The experience would shape his later pacifism, his deep skepticism of patriotism and nationalism, his conviction that war was organized murder that served the interests of power rather than any genuine moral purpose. In November 1855, Tolstoy left the army and travelled to St. Petersburg, Russia's capital, to join the literary world that had been celebrating his work from a distance. He was 27 years old, a published author with growing fame, a veteran of some of the war's hardest fighting, still searching for meaning, but now with a sense that writing might be where he would find it. St. Petersburg would prove to be both inspiring and disillusioning, as most of Tolstoy's experiences with the world beyond his own mind tended to be. The literary world. Leo Tolstoy arrived in St. Petersburg in late 1855, expecting to find kindred spirits among the literary intelligentsia. Here were Russia's leading writers, critics, and thinkers, people who had praised his work, who shared his concerns about Russian society, who were pushing for reform and enlightenment. He was welcomed warmly into the circle around the Contemporary, which included some of Russia's most important literary figures, even Turgenev, already famous for his sportsman sketches, Nikolai Nekrasov, the editor who had first published Tolstoy, Ivan Goncharov, author of Oblomov, and various critics and poets who formed the intellectual elite of Russian literature. Initially, Tolstoy was thrilled. These people understood him, or so he thought. They appreciated his writing. They engaged in serious conversations about art and ideas. They were trying to use literature to change Russia, to push back against censorship and autocracy, to enlighten their readers. But disillusionment came quickly. Tolstoy discovered that literary society had its own vanities, its own hypocrisies, its own games of status and influence. Writers who proclaimed noble ideals in their work behaved pettily toward their rivals. Critics who called for moral seriousness lived dissolute lives. Everyone seemed more interested in reputation than in truth. Tolstoy, never one for social niceties, began speaking his mind too freely. He criticized other writers' work bluntly. He challenged the prevailing political orthodoxies of the liberal intelligentsia. He questioned whether literature had any real value at all, whether it was just another form of upper-class indulgence. His relationship with Ivan Turgenev became particularly strained. Turgenev was the established literary master, elegant, cosmopolitan, beloved in Paris as well as St. Petersburg. Tolstoy was the rough younger writer, intense and judgmental, still half a soldier. They argued about everything: politics, literature, how one should live. In one famous incident in 1861, Tolstoy challenged Turgenev to a duel after a quarrel about Turgenev's daughter's charity work. Tolstoy thought Turgenev was being hypocritical, making a show of charitable giving while living in luxury. Turgenev thought Tolstoy was being insufferably self-righteous. The duel never happened. Both men backed down, but they did not speak for 17 years afterward. During his St. Petersburg period, Tolstoy continued writing. He published Boyhood in 1854 and Youth in 1857, completing his autobiographical trilogy. He worked on various stories and sketches, but he was increasingly dissatisfied with the literary profession, with the idea of being a professional writer who churned out work for magazines, who attended literary dinners, who played the part of the celebrated author. In 1857, Tolstoy made his first trip to Western Europe. He visited Germany, Switzerland, France, and Italy, the grand tour that educated Russians were expected to make. He was not impressed. Paris seemed morally corrupt, its famous sophistication just a veneer over selfishness and materialism. He witnessed a public execution by guillotine and was so horrified that he left France immediately, convinced that European civilization was no better than Russian barbarism, just more hypocritical about it. Switzerland's natural beauty impressed him, but the poverty he saw there disturbed him deeply. In the midst of breathtaking mountain scenery, people were starving. The contrast between natural beauty and human suffering seemed to sum up everything wrong with how society was organized. He returned to Russia in 1858, more convinced than ever that European civilization had nothing to teach Russia, that the solutions to Russia's problems would have to come from Russia itself, from its people and its unique spiritual traditions. Back at Yasnaya Polyana, Tolstoy threw himself into a new project: education for peasant children. If Russia was to improve, it would need an educated populace, and that education should not be imposed from above, but should grow organically from the people's own culture and needs. The school at Yasnaya Polyana, in 1859, Count Leo Tolstoy, now 31 years old and a recognized literary figure, opened a school for peasant children on his estate at Yasnaya Polyana. It was an unusual school, reflecting Tolstoy's increasingly radical ideas about education. There was no set curriculum. Children came when they wanted and left when they wanted. There were no tests, no grades, no punishments. Tolstoy and the teachers he hired tried to make learning interesting and relevant, rather than forcing children to memorize facts. They taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and science, but they adapted their methods to what engaged the children. The school was based on Tolstoy's conviction that education should liberate rather than indoctrinate, that children had an innate curiosity and intelligence that formal schooling usually crushed. He'd been reading Rousseau again, absorbing the idea that civilization corrupted natural virtue, that children needed to be protected from adult corruption rather than forced into adult molds. For several years, Tolstoy devoted enormous energy to the school. He taught classes himself, he wrote educational materials, he published a pedagogical journal describing his methods and his philosophy of education. He travelled to other countries to observe educational systems, became more convinced that conventional schooling was doing more harm than good. The school attracted attention, both positive and negative. Some educators were inspired by Tolstoy's innovations, others thought he was being irresponsible, that children needed discipline and structure. The government was suspicious of any educational work that was not under official control, especially when it was being done by a nobleman with known liberal tendencies. In 1862, while Tolstoy was travelling abroad, police raided Yasnaya Polyana, searching for evidence of revolutionary activity. They found nothing incriminating. Tolstoy was not a political revolutionary, but the raid alarmed him and confirmed his growing conviction that the government was an enemy of freedom and progress. But even as he was devoting himself to education, another transformation was approaching, one that would change his life more profoundly than any amount of teaching or writing. At age 34, Leo Tolstoy was about to fall in love and get married, beginning a relationship that would be both the foundation of his greatest literary work and the source of his deepest misery. Marriage to Sonya. In the summer of 1862, Leo Tolstoy visited Moscow and reconnected with the Bears family, old family friends. Dr. Andrei Bears was a court physician, a cultivated man with 3 daughters. The middle daughter, Sofia Andreevna Bears, called Sonya, was 18 years old, intelligent, well-educated, and rather plain in the way that intelligent young women were often described when their inner lives were more interesting than their faces. Sonya had grown up knowing of Count Leo Tolstoy, the famous writer and friend of her family. She had read his books, she admired his mind. When she saw him again that summer, she was fascinated by this intense, searching man who seemed so different from the boring young men who usually courted girls of her social class. She was at that age when young women are both frightened and excited by the prospect of marriage, uncertain about what life holds, hoping for something extraordinary. Tolstoy, for his part, was struck by Sonya's liveliness and intelligence. Here was someone who understood his ideas, who read seriously, who wanted something more from life than social success and a good marriage. He was also, at 34, feeling the weight of his years of dissipation, his failed relationships, his rootless existence. He wanted stability, family, a home. He wanted to believe that marriage would transform him, would make him the man he kept trying and failing to become. The courtship was intense and brief. They saw each other often during that summer. They talked for hours about books, ideas, life. Tolstoy felt understood in a way he had rarely felt before. Sonya felt chosen, special, elevated by the attention of this famous writer who could have chosen anyone. Within weeks, Tolstoy had proposed, and Sonya accepted. But in a characteristic act of brutal honesty that showed both his integrity and his capacity for cruelty. Before the wedding, Tolstoy gave Sonya his diaries to read, all of them, the complete record of his inner life for the past 15 years, including detailed accounts of his sexual experiences with prostitutes, his affairs with peasant women on his estate, his gambling losses, his moral failures, all of it laid out in excruciating detail. He believed in absolute honesty between husband and wife. He believed that marriage should have no secrets, that they should know each other completely. What he did not fully consider was the psychological impact on an 18-year-old virgin who was about to marry a man with 16 years more life experience and a sexual past that was both extensive and sordid. Sonya was horrified and heartbroken, confronted with evidence of a sexual past that she could never match, could never erase from her imagination. She read about women her husband had slept with, women she might meet in the village at Yasnaya Polyana, women who would know things about her husband that she did not know. The images tortured her. She would never be his first love. She would never be able to give him experiences he had not already had. She was entering the marriage already at a disadvantage, already haunted by ghosts. But she was also in love, or thought she was, caught up in the romance of marrying a famous writer, excited by the prospect of a life different from the conventional existence that awaited most young women of her class. She convinced herself that she could accept his past, that their future would be different, that love would conquer the demons she had seen in those diary pages. They married on September 23rd, 1862, in the church at Yasnaya Polyana. Sonya was 18. Tolstoy was 34. The ceremony was traditional, orthodox, the bride in white, the groom in formal dress, the priest performing the ancient rituals. But the age difference was notable, almost scandalous by some standards. The young bride and the much older groom who carried so much history that she did not share. After the wedding, Sonya left her family home in Moscow, left her mother and father and sisters, and travelled to Yasnaya Polyana to live at the country estate with a husband who was, in many ways, still a stranger. The adjustment was difficult. She was young, used to city life and the society of Moscow. Yasnaya Polyana was isolated, quiet, provincial. The household routines were established without her input. The servants were set in their ways, and there were the peasant women, some of whom had been Tolstoy's lovers, who worked on the estate and whom Sonya saw regularly. But Sonya proved to be remarkably capable. She took over management of the household with efficiency and competence that surprised everyone, including herself. She organized the servants, managed the accounts, supervised the kitchens and the gardens. She brought order to a household that had been somewhat haphazard under bachelor management. Tolstoy, who had always been disorganized about practical matters, was relieved to have someone handle the details of daily life. The early years of the marriage were, by most accounts, happy. Tolstoy was energized by having a companion, someone to share his daily life, someone who was interested in his work and his ideas. He loved having someone to talk to about the books he was reading, the projects he was planning. Sonya provided the domestic stability he'd craved, the sense of home and family that he had lost when his parents died. Sonya, for her part, threw herself into being the perfect wife. She managed the household, she entertained guests, she learned to copy out Tolstoy's manuscripts, deciphering his nearly illegible handwriting, transcribing thousands upon thousands of pages. This would become her primary role for the next 15 years, the copyist who transformed rough drafts into clean manuscripts. Some sections she copied 7, 8, 9 times as Tolstoy revised endlessly. It was exhausting, tedious work, but she took pride in it, in being essential to his creative process. Children came quickly, as they did in all marriages of that era before reliable contraception. Their first son, Sergei, was born in June 1863, 9 months after the wedding. Sonya was not quite 19 when she became a mother. She devoted herself to motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything, nursing the baby herself rather than hiring a wet nurse, keeping detailed records of his development, worrying over every illness and milestone. Then came Tatiana in 1864, named after Tolstoy's beloved Antoinette. Ilya followed in 1866, Lev in 1869, Maria in 1871. The nursery at Yasnaya Polyana began to fill with the sounds of children, just as it had when Tolstoy himself was a boy. By 1872, Sonya had given birth to 7 children in 10 years, though not all survived. Pyotr died at 18 months, a devastating loss. Another son, Nikolai, died at 11 months. The grief of losing children, common as it was in that era, marked both parents deeply. Over the next 16 years, Sonya would bear 13 children in total. 9 survived to adulthood: Sergei, Tatiana, Ilya, Lev, Maria, Andrei, Mikhail, Alexandra, and Ivan. The constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, nursing, and early child-rearing dominated Sonya's 20s and 30s. She aged quickly, her body worn down by repeated childbirth, her youth consumed by domestic duties. The children grounded Tolstoy in ways that nothing else in his life had. He was fascinated by their development, by watching personalities emerge from infancy. He observed them with the same intense attention he brought to everything, taking notes that would later inform his understanding of childhood and family life in his novels. He played with them, told them stories, taught them to ride and swim. He was a more involved father than most aristocratic men of his era, genuinely interested in his children rather than simply delegating their care to servants. And during these early years of marriage, surrounded by domestic life, grounded in routine and family, Tolstoy began the work that would make him immortal. In 1863 he started writing what would become War and Peace. A Day in the Life at Yasnaya Polyana. Before we continue with the great novels, let us pause to observe the daily rhythm of life at Yasnaya Polyana during the 1860s and early 1870s, when Tolstoy was in his prime and the household was at its most vibrant. Tolstoy rose early, usually around 7 or 8 in the morning. He did not like sleeping late, considered it a sign of moral weakness. He would wash with cold water, a practice he maintained year-round, believing it strengthened character and health. In summer he might bathe in the pond. In winter he would break ice to pour frigid water over himself. It was part of his endless program of self-improvement, his belief that physical discipline led to moral discipline. Breakfast was simple: porridge, bread, perhaps some fruit. Tolstoy ate moderately, though he would not become a vegetarian until the 1880s. During the 1860s and 1870s he still ate meat, though he was never a heavy eater. He drank tea constantly, glass after glass of strong black tea in the Russian style, brewed in a samovar that was kept going all day. After breakfast, Tolstoy would go to his study on the ground floor of the house. The room was spacious but simply furnished: a desk, bookshelves lining the walls, a sofa where he sometimes napped. The desk was always covered with papers, manuscripts, books lying open, pens and inkwells, the organized chaos of a working writer. Light came from large windows that looked out over the gardens and birch groves. This was his sacred time, the morning hours when he wrote. He worked in intense concentration, often for 4 or 5 hours straight, covering page after page with his nearly illegible handwriting. When he was deep in a novel, he became almost unreachable, barely aware of the household around him, living inside the world he was creating. His handwriting was famously difficult to read. The letters were cramped, irregular, frequently crossed out and written over. Only Sonya could reliably decipher it. This made her role as copyist essential. Every afternoon or evening she would take his morning's work and transcribe it into clean copy, preparing it for the next stage of revision. Without her, his work would have been almost impossible to publish. Around midday, Tolstoy would emerge from his study for lunch, the main meal of the day in Russian households. The family gathered in the dining room. Tolstoy and Sonya, whatever children were old enough to eat at table, often a tutor or governess, sometimes guests. Meals were substantial: soup, meat, vegetables, dessert. Conversation ranged freely over topics of the day: books, ideas, estate business. Tolstoy dominated discussions, as he dominated most spaces he occupied, not through bullying, but through the intensity of his engagement with every topic. After lunch, there might be a walk. Tolstoy loved walking through the estate, through the birch groves, along the paths he had known since childhood. He walked briskly, energetically, often alone but sometimes with family or guests. Walking helped him think, worked out the problems in whatever he was writing. He might walk for an hour or two, covering several miles, returning to the house refreshed. Sonya spent her afternoons managing the household and copying manuscripts. She met with the housekeeper, discussed menus, dealt with problems among the servants, supervised the children's lessons, and handled the 1,000 details that kept a large household running. And then she sat at her own desk and began the tedious work of transcribing Tolstoy's morning pages, deciphering his handwriting, producing clean copy. Evening brought the family together again. Tea was served, more glasses of strong tea from the samovar. Children who were old enough might read aloud or recite lessons. There might be music. Sonya played piano. Tolstoy enjoyed listening. Sometimes Tolstoy read aloud from what he was working on, testing passages on family members, watching their reactions. Guests were frequent at Yasnaya Polyana. Writers, critics, old friends, relatives, all made the journey from Moscow or St. Petersburg to visit the famous author. Turgenev came before their quarrel. Fett, the poet, was a regular visitor. Conversations went late into the night, arguments about literature and philosophy and politics. Tolstoy always at the centre, always challenging, always pushing everyone to think harder. After guests departed or the evening grew late, Tolstoy might retreat to his study again, not to write but to read. He was an omnivorous reader, consuming everything from philosophy to history, to novels to religious texts. His library was extensive, thousands of volumes in Russian, French, English, German. He read rapidly, intensely, always with a purpose, always extracting ideas that fed his own thinking. He went to bed relatively early by modern standards, usually by 11 or midnight. Sleep was another area of moral discipline. Too much sleep was weakness. Too little impaired the work. He aimed for 7 or 8 hours, no more, no less. This was the pattern, day after day, year after year, the routine that produced War and Peace and Anna Karenina. It was a life of extraordinary productivity, grounded in domestic stability, enabled by a household that ran smoothly because Sonya managed it, supported by a wife who subordinated her own ambitions to her husband's genius. But the routine had costs that were not visible on the surface. Sonya was exhausted by the endless cycle of pregnancy, child-rearing, and manuscript copying. She had literary ambitions of her own that she suppressed. She resented the constant stream of guests who disrupted the household and demanded her hospitality. She was lonely, married to a man whose inner life was focused on his work rather than on her. And Tolstoy, for all his domestic happiness, was beginning to feel the stirrings of the spiritual crisis that would transform the second half of his life. Even as he wrote his greatest novels, even as he lived surrounded by family and success, the questions were forming. What is the point of all this? What meaning does any of it have in the face of death? Why do we live? The answers he would eventually find would destroy the comfortable pattern of these years and would transform him from a novelist into a prophet. But that transformation was still in the future, for now, in the late 1860s, Leo Tolstoy was simply a writer at the height of his powers, producing page after page of the greatest novel anyone had yet written in Russian, or perhaps in any language. The creation of War and Peace. Leo Tolstoy spent 6 years, from 1863 to 1869, writing War and Peace. It was originally conceived as a novel about the Decembrist uprising of 1825, when liberal Russian officers attempted a coup against Tsar Nicholas I after the death of Alexander I. These officers, many of whom had served in the campaigns against Napoleon, and had seen Western Europe, had returned to Russia hoping to reform the autocratic system. Their uprising was crushed, the leaders were hanged, others were exiled to Siberia. Tolstoy was interested in these men because they represented the conflict between European ideas of liberty and Russian autocracy, a conflict that still defined Russian intellectual life in the 1860s. He wanted to write about their idealism, their tragic failure, their exile. But as he researched and wrote, the story moved backward in time. To understand the Decembrists of 1825, he needed to understand the generation that had fought Napoleon. And to understand that generation, he needed to understand the War of 1812 itself, when Napoleon invaded Russia with the largest army Europe had yet seen. The scope of the project grew beyond anything Tolstoy had originally imagined. What began as a relatively focused historical novel about the Decembrists expanded into a massive exploration of Russian society during the Napoleonic Wars, following multiple aristocratic families, dozens of major and minor characters, across both war and peace, across battles and ballrooms, across 15 years of Russian history from 1805 to 1820. Tolstoy researched obsessively, with the thoroughness that marked everything he did. He read historical accounts of the Napoleonic Wars, Russian, French, German, English. He read military records, battle reports, memoirs of participants. He studied maps of battles, troop movements, strategies. He visited battlefields, including Borodino, the site of the largest and bloodiest battle of the 1812 campaign, which took place about 75 miles west of Moscow. At Borodino, Tolstoy walked the field where Russian and French armies had clashed in September 1812, where perhaps 70,000 men had been killed or wounded in a single day. He tried to imagine what it had been like: the cannon fire, the cavalry charges, the infantry advancing into musket fire, the chaos and terror and bravery. The battlefield had long since returned to peaceful farmland, but Tolstoy could envision what it had been, could recreate it in prose so vivid that readers would feel they were there. He also absorbed every detail he could find about how people lived in the early 1800s, how they dressed, what they ate, how they spoke, what their houses looked like, what their social gatherings were like, what ideas animated them. He wanted absolute historical accuracy in the details, while using those details to explore timeless themes. But War and Peace was never just a historical novel in the conventional sense. Tolstoy was using the past to explore fundamental questions about history and human nature. The novel's philosophical sections, which some readers find intrusive and others find essential, grapple with questions that obsessed Tolstoy. How much control do individuals have over events? Are great leaders like Napoleon actually in charge of history, or are they swept along by forces they do not understand? What is the relationship between the vast movements of history and the small, intimate moments of individual lives? Tolstoy developed a theory of history that ran counter to the great man theory popular in his era. He argued that Napoleon did not create the events of the Napoleonic Wars. Rather, millions of individual decisions and actions by ordinary people created the conditions that made the wars happen, and Napoleon was simply the most visible symbol of those deeper forces. Leaders believe they are controlling events when they are actually being controlled by them. This philosophy runs through the novel. Tolstoy repeatedly shows powerful men believing they are making decisions that will shape history, then shows how their decisions are overwhelmed or redirected by circumstances beyond their control. Count Rostov thinks he is managing his family's finances. He bankrupts them through a series of well-intentioned but ill-considered decisions. Prince Andrei thinks he will find glory in war. He finds only disillusionment and injury. Napoleon thinks he is conquering Russia. The country swallows his army and destroys it. The novel has no single protagonist in the traditional sense. Instead, it follows several families and multiple characters across the 15 years of the narrative. The three most important characters, the ones whose inner lives we inhabit most fully, are Pierre Bezukhov, Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, and Natasha Rostova. Pierre Bezukhov is the illegitimate son of a wealthy count. When his father dies and leaves him a vast fortune, Pierre is suddenly one of the richest men in Russia. But wealth does not bring happiness or meaning. Pierre is awkward, idealistic, intellectually curious, emotionally naive. He searches for meaning everywhere, in Freemasonry, in rational reform of his estates, in marriage, in philosophy. He marries the beautiful Hélène Kuragina, who does not love him and who is unfaithful. He challenges her lover to a duel. His life becomes a series of false starts and disappointments. Only gradually, through suffering and observation, does Pierre begin to understand what it means to live well. Prince Andrei Bolkonsky is Pierre's opposite in many ways: aristocratic, disciplined, ambitious for glory and meaning through achievement. He goes to war seeking to distinguish himself, to be like Napoleon, to leave his mark on history. He is wounded at the Battle of Austerlitz, and lying on his back looking up at the vast indifferent sky, realizes the futility of earthly ambition. He recovers and retreats from public life, but he cannot remain in retirement. He falls in love with Natasha Rostova, but the engagement ends when Natasha, young and impulsive, is briefly seduced by the worthless Anatole Kuragin. Andrei fights again in 1812, is wounded again at Borodino, and slowly dies, achieving spiritual peace only as he is dying. Natasha Rostova is introduced as a vibrant child, all emotion and energy and life. We watch her grow from girlhood to womanhood, experiencing her first ball, her first love, her mistakes and suffering. She nearly destroys herself through her infatuation with Anatole. She's redeemed by nursing Prince Andrei as he dies. She eventually marries Pierre, and in the novel's epilogue we see her as a somewhat dowdy mother, her youthful vivacity transformed into domestic competence. Some readers find this transformation tragic, others see it as the natural progression of life. Beyond these central three, War and Peace contains dozens of memorable characters, each rendered with psychological precision. Old Count Rostov, generous and impractical. Countess Rostova, concerned only with social position. Nikolai Rostov, decent and conventional. Dolokhov, the dangerous adventurer. Princess Maria Bolkonskaya, plain and devout. The old Prince Bolkonsky, tyrannical and brilliant, and on and on. Tolstoy had an almost superhuman ability to create characters who felt like real people, with complex internal lives and contradictory motives. These characters were not simply invented from nothing. They were composites, drawing on people Tolstoy knew, people from history, people from memoirs and letters, and aspects of Tolstoy himself. Pierre's spiritual searching is clearly Tolstoy's own, his endless questioning of how to live, what gives meaning to existence. Prince Andrei's aristocratic pride and his disillusionment with glory reflects Tolstoy's experiences in the military and his growing skepticism about conventional ambition. Natasha is partly based on Sonya, partly on Tolstoy's sister-in-law Tanya Bears, whom Sonya brought to Yasnaya Polyana and who became part of the household, partly on idealized memories of women from Tolstoy's youth. The writing process was grueling. Tolstoy wrote every morning in his study, producing page after page in his nearly illegible handwriting. Some passages came easily, flowing from his pen. Others required multiple drafts, endless revision, trying different approaches to the same scene until he found the one that worked. He would read passages aloud to Sonya, watching her reaction, revising based on what engaged her and what left her cold. Sonya would copy out the day's work in the afternoons and evenings, transcribing thousands of pages over the 6 years of composition. Some sections she copied 7 or 8 times, as Tolstoy revised and revised again. The famous scene of Natasha's first ball, one of the most beautiful passages in the novel, was revised repeatedly. The death of Prince Andrei took multiple drafts before Tolstoy was satisfied that he had captured the experience of dying with the spiritual insight he wanted. The battle scenes drew on Tolstoy's own military experience, but filtered through years of reflection and his evolving philosophy of war. He showed combat not as glorious but as chaotic, terrifying, often pointless. He showed officers who had no idea what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings, soldiers who fought bravely without understanding why, strategies that fell apart in the face of reality. The Borodino sequence is one of the most powerful depictions of battle in literature, precisely because it refuses to glamorize warfare. The work was published serially in the Russian Messenger from 1865 to 1867, under the title The Year 1805. Readers followed the story in installments, eagerly awaiting each new section. The response was extraordinary from the beginning. Here was something unprecedented in Russian literature, a vast panorama of history and private life, combining historical accuracy with profound psychological insight, mixing philosophy with romance, warfare with domestic scenes. When the complete book version was published in 1869, now under the title War and Peace, the response was even more overwhelming. Critics struggled to categorize it. Was it a novel, a philosophical treatise, a historical epic? It seemed to transcend genre. Some complained about the philosophical digressions, the long essays on history and free will that interrupted the narrative. Others found these sections essential to understanding Tolstoy's vision. What no one could dispute was the power of the work. War and Peace was immediately recognized as a masterpiece, perhaps the greatest Russian novel yet written. Turgenev, despite his quarrel with Tolstoy, admitted that parts of it were magnificent. Dostoevsky, who was creating his own masterpieces in the 1860s, recognized that Tolstoy had achieved something unique. What made War and Peace great was not just its scope, though the scope was unprecedented. It was Tolstoy's ability to render inner experience with a precision that no novelist had achieved before. He showed how minds actually work, how people rationalize their actions to themselves, how they deceive themselves, how they change gradually over time through accumulated experience rather than sudden revelation. His characters thought and felt with a complexity that made them seem more real than real people often seem. He also captured the texture of life in a way that made the past come alive. The small details, how a woman's dress rustled, the sound of hoofbeats on frozen ground, the smell of a military camp, what it felt like to be young and at your first ball, what it felt like to charge into battle, what it felt like to be old and dying. All of it rendered with absolute authority, with a command of detail that came from extensive research, but felt effortless in the reading. By 1869, when the final version was published in book form, Leo Tolstoy was 41 years old. He was recognized as one of Russia's greatest living writers. War and Peace had established him as a literary genius, on par with anyone who had ever written in any language. He was famous throughout Russia and increasingly known in Western Europe as translations began to appear. He was secure in his marriage, father to a growing family, living comfortably at Yasnaya Polyana, financially stable. And he was profoundly unhappy. Despite the success, or perhaps because of it, despite the domestic stability, or perhaps because of that too, Tolstoy was spiraling into a crisis that would fundamentally transform his understanding of life and art. The questions that Pierre Bezukhov asked in War and Peace, questions about meaning and purpose, were Tolstoy's own questions. And writing the novel, working through these questions through his characters, had not answered them. If anything, It had made them more urgent. But before the crisis fully consumed him, before his spiritual transformation began in earnest, Tolstoy would write one more novel, one more supreme work of pure literary art, a book that many critics consider even greater than War and Peace in its psychological depth and moral complexity. He would write Anna Karenina. Anna Karenina and the Gathering Darkness. In 1873, Tolstoy began writing Anna Karenina, the novel that many critics consider even greater than War and Peace. Where War and Peace was epic and historical, Anna Karenina was contemporary and intimate, a story of love, adultery, family, and the moral fabric of Russian society. The inspiration came from a real incident. In 1872, a woman named Anna Pirogova, who had been the mistress of a neighbour of Tolstoy's, threw herself under a train after her lover rejected her. Tolstoy attended the autopsy and was haunted by the image of the woman's body, mangled by the train. From this tragic seed grew the story of Anna Karenina, a beautiful and intelligent woman trapped in a loveless marriage to a cold government official. She falls passionately in love with Count Vronsky, a dashing cavalry officer, and leaves her husband and son to be with him. But instead of finding happiness, she finds social condemnation, emotional isolation, and eventually despair that leads her to suicide under the wheels of a train. But Anna Karenina is not just Anna's story. The novel has a second plotline, equally important, following Konstantin Levin, a country landowner who is clearly a fictionalized version of Tolstoy himself. Levin struggles with questions of faith, marriage, work, and how to live a meaningful life. He finds happiness in marriage and family, in physical labor alongside his peasants, in simple living close to the land. The two stories run in parallel, Anna's tragic descent and Levin's difficult ascent toward meaning. The contrast is deliberate. Anna seeks happiness through passion and romantic love, violating social norms following her desires. She is destroyed. Levin seeks happiness through duty, work, family, and faith. He finds a measure of peace, though not without continued struggle. Tolstoy wrote Anna Karenina over 4 years, from 1873 to 1877. The novel was serialized in The Russian Messenger and published in book form in 1878. Once again, the response was overwhelming. Anna Karenina was immediately recognized as a masterpiece, perhaps even superior to War and Peace in its psychological depth and moral complexity. The famous opening line, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way," became one of the most quoted sentences in literature. The novel's portrayal of Anna's passion and suffering was so vivid that readers felt they knew her personally. Levin's spiritual searching resonated with everyone who'd ever questioned life's meaning. But even as Tolstoy was finishing this supreme work of art, he was undergoing a personal transformation that would lead him to reject everything he had achieved. The crisis had been building for years, visible in Levin's character, in the questions that Levin asked about faith and meaning. But in Tolstoy's own life, the crisis was becoming unbearable. In his late 40s and early 50s, at the height of his fame, surrounded by family, financially secure, celebrated as one of the world's great writers, Leo Tolstoy was consumed by thoughts of death and the meaninglessness of existence. He could not understand why he should continue living when death would erase everything. What was the point of writing novels when they would be forgotten? What was the point of loving his children when they would die? What was the point of anything in a universe that seemed indifferent to human striving? The crisis came to a head in 1879 when Tolstoy experienced what he would later describe in a confession, his spiritual autobiography. He was staying in the city of Alzheimer's on a trip to inspect a property he was thinking of buying. Alone in a hotel room at night, he was seized by overwhelming terror a visceral horror of death and nothingness that left him shaking and gasping for breath. The Alzheimer's experience, as it came to be known, marked the point of no return. Tolstoy could not go back to his old life, could not pretend that literature and family and comfort were enough. He needed answers to questions about the meaning of existence, and he needed them urgently. He turned to philosophy first. He read Schopenhauer, Kant, Hegel, all the great Western thinkers. They provided no comfort. Then he turned to science, thinking that perhaps rational understanding of the universe could provide meaning. Science told him that humans were insignificant specks in an indifferent cosmos. That did not help. Finally, he turned to religion, but not to the Russian Orthodox Church that he'd been baptized into. He turned to the Gospels, to the words of Jesus, reading them as if for the first time, trying to strip away all the Church's interpretations and get to the core teaching. What he found there transformed him. He became convinced that Jesus' message was about how to live in this world, not about salvation in the next. The Sermon on the Mount, with its commands to love your enemies, to turn the other cheek, to give to those who ask, this was the key. If everyone lived this way, there would be no violence, no oppression, no suffering. The kingdom of heaven was not a place you went after death. It was what the world would become if people followed Jesus' teachings. This was the beginning of Tolstoy's religious period, the last 30 years of his life, when he would become less a novelist and more a religious teacher, a moral philosopher, an increasingly radical critic of every institution in Russian society. The religious transformation. By 1880, Leo Tolstoy had undergone a complete spiritual transformation. The man who had written War and Peace and Anna Karenina now declared that all art, including his own greatest works, was essentially worthless. What mattered was living righteously, following the teachings of Jesus, creating the kingdom of heaven on earth. He wrote a confession, published in 1882, which described his spiritual crisis and his conversion to a radical form of Christianity. He laid out his understanding of Jesus' teachings in works like The Gospel in Brief, 1881, What I Believe, 1884, and The Kingdom of God is Within You, 1894. Tolstoy's version of Christianity was shocking to Orthodox believers and to the church hierarchy. He rejected the supernatural, no virgin birth, no resurrection, no miracles, no life after death. He saw Jesus not as the Son of God, but as a supremely wise moral teacher. The Gospels, stripped of later additions and interpretations, contained a revolutionary social program, nonviolence, love of enemies, refusal to judge others, communal sharing of property, rejection of all authority that was based on force. From these principles, Tolstoy drew radical conclusions. All government was evil because it was based on violence. Armies, police, courts, prisons, all of these institutions existed to coerce people, which violated Jesus' command to love and not to resist evil with violence. Therefore, a true Christian could not serve in the military, could not participate in government, could not even take an oath, since Jesus had said not to swear oaths. Private property was theft. Jesus had said to give to those who ask, to not resist those who take from you. Therefore the wealth that nobles like Tolstoy possessed was stolen from the peasants, who actually produced it through their labor. Orthodox Christianity was a perversion of Jesus' teachings. The Church had allied with the state, blessed wars, accumulated wealth, and taught doctrines that Jesus never taught. The church hierarchy were hypocrites who lived in luxury while preaching humility. These were not abstract opinions. Tolstoy tried to live according to these principles, with varying degrees of success and spectacular degrees of hypocrisy that he himself was painfully aware of. He gave up meat, alcohol, tobacco, and hunting. He became a vegetarian in the 1880s, decades before it was fashionable. He tried to give up his wealth, to distribute his land to the peasants. His wife Sonya fought him bitterly on this, and he compromised, giving some land but retaining the main estate. He renounced the copyrights to his works written after 1881, allowing anyone to publish them without paying him royalties. This infuriated Sonya, who saw it as stealing from their children's inheritance. Tolstoy saw it as a moral necessity. How could he talk about rejecting property while profiting from his books? He began dressing like a peasant, wearing rough linen shirts and boots instead of fashionable European clothes. He worked in the fields with the peasants, ploughing and harvesting, believing that all people should earn their bread through manual labour. The spectacle of a famous count working like a peasant fascinated observers and embarrassed his family. He also became a prolific writer of religious and moral essays, turning out thousands of pages explaining his beliefs, arguing with critics, refining his ideas. He wrote about education, about vegetarianism, about art, about economic justice, about the evils of the state. He became one of the most influential political thinkers of his era, inspiring anarchists, pacifists, and reformers around the world. His ideas influenced Leo Tolstoy societies that formed in Russia and abroad, groups of people trying to live according to his teachings. He corresponded with followers from around the world. His fame as a religious teacher eventually eclipsed his fame as a novelist, at least for a time. But his religious transformation destroyed his family life. Sonya did not share his conversion. She thought his new beliefs were foolish and dangerous. She wanted to protect their children's future, which meant protecting the estate and the copyrights. She saw his followers as freeloaders who were taking advantage of her husband's fame. She became bitter, resentful, increasingly unstable. The marriage, which had been happy in the 1860s and 1870s, became a battlefield in the 1880s and beyond. Tolstoy and Sonya fought constantly, about money, about the children, about his beliefs, about his followers, about everything. Their fights were epic and were sometimes observed by visitors, to everyone's embarrassment. Tolstoy's diaries from this period are filled with complaints about Sonya, with prayers for patience, with guilt about his own inability to love his wife as Christian teaching demanded. Sonya's diaries are filled with rage at Leo, with accusations of his hypocrisy, with despair about her life. The tragedy was that both of them were trapped. Tolstoy could not leave without appearing to violate his own principles. Sonya could not leave without losing her social position and financial security. So they stayed together, making each other miserable, year after year after year. And through all of this domestic misery, Tolstoy continued to write, but now his writing was in service of his religious ideas, late works, and the power of narrative. Despite his rejection of art as essentially useless vanity, Leo Tolstoy could not stop being an artist. Even his religious works were written with extraordinary literary power, and occasionally, despite himself, he would produce works of pure fiction that demonstrated that his narrative genius had not diminished. In 1886 he wrote The Death of Ivan Ilyich, a novella about a conventional man who discovers, as he is dying from a painful illness, that he has wasted his entire life on meaningless pursuits. It is one of the most powerful depictions of death in literature, claustrophobic and terrifying, but also ultimately hopeful, as Ivan at the very end experiences a moment of spiritual clarity. The Death of Ivan Ilyich is often read as Tolstoy working out his own fears of meaningless death, his own crisis from the Alzheimer's experience. The story's power comes from Tolstoy's absolute honesty about the terror of dying and the emptiness of conventional life. It remains one of the most frequently taught works in medical schools, where doctors study it to understand patient experiences of terminal illness. In 1889, Tolstoy wrote the Kreutzer Sonata, a disturbing novella about sexual jealousy, marriage, and violence. The story is narrated by a man who has murdered his wife in a jealous rage. He describes how sexual passion poisoned his marriage, how possessiveness and jealousy destroyed any possibility of true companionship. The novella shocked readers with its frank discussion of sexuality and its seeming condemnation of all sexual relations, even within marriage. The Kreutzer Sonata was so controversial that it was banned in Russia. Sonya had to personally petition Tsar Alexander III to get permission to include it in the collected work she was publishing. The Tsar agreed, but the novella remained banned as a separate publication. In the 1890s, Tolstoy wrote Resurrection, a novel about a nobleman who recognizes a prostitute on trial as a woman he had seduced years earlier when she was a servant in his household. Consumed with guilt, he tries to save her, following her into exile in Siberia, attempting to atone for his sin. The novel is a savage attack on Russian institutions, the courts, the prisons, the church, the aristocracy. It is also a story of one man's moral awakening and his attempt, however flawed, to live according to his conscience. Resurrection was serialized in a literary journal, and Tolstoy donated all the proceeds to help a persecuted religious sect, the Doukhobors, emigrate to Canada. This was typical of late Tolstoy, using his literary fame to support causes he believed in, caring nothing for the money or recognition. He also wrote short stories with explicit moral purposes. How Much Land Does a Man Need? About greed and the futility of accumulation. Master and Man, about a wealthy merchant who discovers at the moment of death the meaning of love. And Father Sergius, about a monk who struggles with pride and lust. These late works lack the expansive humanity of War and Peace, or the psychological complexity of Anna Karenina. They are more obviously didactic, designed to teach lessons rather than to simply portray life. But at their best, they still have immense power, because Tolstoy's gift for dramatizing moral and spiritual struggles was undiminished. Throughout the 1890s and into the 1900s, Tolstoy's fame continued to grow internationally. He was translated into dozens of languages. His religious writings were read by reformers, anarchists and seekers around the world. Gandhi read, "The kingdom of God is within you," and credited it with inspiring his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. Tolstoy and Gandhi corresponded, two men from vastly different cultures who had arrived at similar conclusions about the evil of violence and the power of moral resistance. Tolstoy became a kind of secular saint, a moral authority whose pronouncements on everything from vegetarianism to war were eagerly awaited by the world press. Pilgrims came to Yasnaya Polyana to see him, to ask for his advice, to touch the hem of his peasant smock. He was both the most famous writer in the world and the most famous religious teacher, a combination that was unprecedented and would never be repeated. But the Russian Orthodox Church was watching with increasing alarm. This man who rejected church authority, who denied Christ's divinity, who preached doctrines contrary to Orthodox teaching, and who had enormous influence over the educated classes and even some of the peasantry, could not be tolerated indefinitely. In 1901, the Church acted. The Holy Synod issued a decree excommunicating Leo Tolstoy from the Russian Orthodox Church. The Excommunication. The decree of excommunication, issued by the Holy Synod on February 20th, 1901, did not technically create Tolstoy's excommunication, but rather announced that he had excommunicated himself through his beliefs and writings. The Church's statement said that Tolstoy had rejected the fundamental doctrines of Christianity, and therefore had placed himself outside the Church. Tolstoy was not surprised. He had been expecting this for years. His response was calm and measured. He wrote a reply in which he affirmed that yes, he did reject the supernatural elements of Christian doctrine. Yes, He did believe the church had corrupted Jesus' teachings, and yes, he did feel liberated rather than condemned by being formally separated from an institution he considered false. The excommunication made international news. Here was one of the world's most famous men being expelled from the church of his baptism. Liberals and radicals celebrated Tolstoy as a martyr to free thought. Conservatives condemned him as a dangerous heretic. The Russian government worried about public disorder, as crowds gathered outside Yasnaya Polyana to show support for Tolstoy. The church's hope that excommunication would diminish Tolstoy's influence backfired completely. If anything, it increased his stature as a moral independent, someone willing to stand against institutional power for the sake of truth as he understood it. Sonya was devastated by the excommunication. She was an Orthodox believer, and having her husband officially declared a heretic was deeply painful. She petitioned the church to reconsider, but Tolstoy would not recant. He could not deny what he believed to be true simply to restore himself to the church's good graces. The excommunication marked the beginning of the final decade of Tolstoy's life, years that would be marked by increasing conflict with his family, deteriorating health, and a final desperate attempt to escape from a life that had become unbearable. The final years. By 1900, Leo Tolstoy was 72 years old, world famous, increasingly frail, and profoundly unhappy. His relationship with Sonya had deteriorated to the point where they could barely speak civilly to each other. She blamed him for throwing away their wealth and status on foolish religious ideas. He blamed her for refusing to live according to Christian principles. Both accusations had truth to them, and both were unfair. The central conflict was over Tolstoy's copyrights and his will. Tolstoy wanted to renounce all copyright to all his works, both before and after 1881, making everything public domain so that no one could profit from his writing after his death. Sonya was determined to preserve the copyrights for their children's inheritance. Tolstoy's followers, particularly Vladimir Chertkov, his closest disciple, encouraged him to stand firm. Sonya saw Chertkov as an evil manipulator who was stealing her husband from her. The situation became increasingly bizarre and painful. Tolstoy would write versions of his will giving copyrights away. Sonya would find the documents and destroy them, or demand that he tear them up. Tolstoy's followers would smuggle new will versions in and out of Yasnaya Polyana. Sonya would search Tolstoy's papers, read his diaries, accuse him of plotting against her. Tolstoy was trapped between his principles and his pity. He believed that owning property was wrong, that accumulating wealth violated Jesus' teachings. But he could not bring himself to actually impoverish his family, to leave Sonya and their children with nothing, and part of him, the part that had grown up as a count, could not quite imagine actually living in poverty himself. So he compromised, endlessly, satisfying no one, least of all himself. He gave away some copyrights, but not all. He simplified his life, but still lived in a comfortable manor house. He preached poverty while being waited on by servants. The contradictions that had always been present in his thinking became impossible to ignore or reconcile. His health began to fail. He had always been physically vigorous, but age was catching up. He suffered from intestinal problems, from weakness, from the ordinary deteriorations of old age. He continued his daily routine of writing and walking, but he could feel his body giving out. The world continued to beat a path to his door. Journalists, reformers, writers, curiosity seekers all came to Yasnaya Polyana to see the great man. Tolstoy received them with varying degrees of patience. Sometimes he was gracious and engaging. Sometimes he was irritable and wanted to be left alone. But the stream of visitors never stopped. His family was a source of both joy and sorrow. Some of his children had stayed close to him emotionally. Others had drifted away, unable to deal with his religious intensity, and the chaos of his conflict with their mother. His daughter Alexandra became his secretary and closest companion in his last years, devoted to him and to his teachings. In the summer of 1910, at age 82, Tolstoy's situation reached a breaking point. The fights with Sonya intensified. She was by this point showing signs of serious mental illness, paranoid, obsessive, threatening suicide. Tolstoy was exhausted, worn down by decades of conflict, desperate for peace before he died. He began to think seriously about leaving, about simply walking away from Yasnaya Polyana and everything it represented. Where would he go? He did not know. He was 82 years old. He had no money of his own. But the idea of escape, of finding some quiet place to live out his last days according to his principles, became overwhelming. On the night of October 28, 1910, Leo Tolstoy made his decision. He would leave, now, immediately. In the middle of the night, while everyone slept. The flight. At 3 o'clock in the morning on October 28, 1910, Leo Tolstoy woke his daughter Alexandra and told her to pack. They were leaving. She did not question him. She had been expecting this. She gathered some clothes, some papers, and helped her father dress in the darkness. They crept out of the house like thieves, Tolstoy, the elderly master, fleeing from his own estate. They woke the estate doctor, Dushan Makovitsky, who had become Tolstoy's companion and physician. The three of them walked through the dark to the train station at Szczecino, several miles from Yasnaya Polyana. They took a train south, without a clear destination. Tolstoy wanted to visit his sister Maria, who was a nun at a convent. He wanted to find some monastery or hermitage where he could live simply and quietly. He wanted above all to be free of the conflict that was consuming his last days. But he was Leo Tolstoy. Even fleeing in the night, he could not be invisible. Other passengers recognized him. Word began to spread. By the time they reached the convent where his sister lived, telegrams were already flying around Russia. The great writer had fled from his home. Where was he going? Why had he left? Was he dying? Tolstoy visited his sister briefly, but he could not stay. He was not well. The strain of travel, the cold, the exhaustion, all of it was too much for an 82-year-old body. He developed a fever. His breathing became laboured. He needed to rest. They got back on a train, heading vaguely south, but Tolstoy was deteriorating. At the small railway junction of Astapovo, the station master insisted they get off. Tolstoy was clearly very ill. He needed medical care. The station master offered his own small house, and Tolstoy was carried there, to a modest room with a narrow bed. He would never leave that room alive. Doctors were summoned, family members were telegraphed. Reporters descended on Astapovo from around the world. The news that Tolstoy was dying became a global event, telegraphed to newspapers in every major city. Bulletins were issued hourly. Tolstoy's temperature, his breathing, his level of consciousness. Sonya arrived but was not allowed to see him. Tolstoy's followers believed that seeing her would agitate him, would disturb his last hours. She waited in a train car parked near the station house, desperate to see her husband one last time, forbidden entry by his disciples. Tolstoy drifted in and out of consciousness, pneumonia filling his lungs, his body finally giving out after 82 years. When he was conscious, he spoke fragments that those around him tried to record. To seek, always to seek. Truth. I love much. The words were disconnected, the meanings unclear. On the morning of November the 20th, 1910, at 6 o'clock, Leo Tolstoy died. The station master's house at Astapovo, this tiny insignificant place, became the site of one of the most famous deaths in literary history. His last words, reported by those present, were, "The truth. I love much. How they." and then nothing. The funeral and aftermath, Sonya was finally allowed into the room where her husband's body lay. She had not seen him alive. Now she saw him dead. She stayed with the body for hours, weeping, talking to him. 50 years of marriage ended in a stranger's house at a railway junction in the middle of nowhere. The body was taken back to Yasnaya Polyana by train. Thousands of people lined the route, wanting to see the coffin of the great writer pass by. It was an unofficial public mourning on a scale that alarmed the Russian government. The authorities feared demonstrations, feared that Tolstoy's death might spark political unrest. The funeral itself, on November 23, 1910, drew enormous crowds to Yasnaya Polyana. Conservative estimates put the number at several thousand. Some reports claimed 10,000 or more. Peasants, students, intellectuals, aristocrats, all came to pay their respects. The police were present in large numbers, watching nervously. Tolstoy had requested the simplest possible funeral. No religious ceremony, no speeches, just burial in the earth. His family honoured his wishes as best they could under the circumstances. There was no orthodox service which scandalised the church. There were no official honours from the government, which Tolstoy would have refused anyway. He was buried in the forest at Yasnaya Polyana, on the edge of a ravine, in the spot where his brother Nikolai had told him the green stick was buried. The stick that held the secret of making all people happy. It was a location from childhood games, now become a grave. The burial was simple. The coffin was lowered into the ground. No headstone was placed as Tolstoy had requested. The grave was marked only by the mound of earth and the trees around it. It remains that way today. More than a century later, a simple grave in the woods, visited by thousands every year. Sonya lived another 9 years, until 1919. She published her husband's collected works, protecting the copyrights that he had wanted to renounce, providing for their children as she had always insisted she must. She wrote her own memoirs, defending herself against those who blamed her for Tolstoy's unhappiness, presenting her side of their long and painful marriage. The children scattered. Some remained in Russia through the revolution and the Soviet period. Others emigrated. The Tolstoy family line continued, and there are descendants of Leo and Sonya alive today, spread across the world. The legacy. Leo Tolstoy has been dead for more than 113 years. The world he knew, Imperial Russia with its czars and aristocrats and serfs, disappeared in the revolution of 1917, just 7 years after his death. The Soviet Union rose and fell. The 20th century happened, with all its horrors and wonders, and through all of it, Tolstoy's influence has endured and grown. War and Peace and Anna Karenina remain among the greatest novels ever written in any language. They are still read, still taught, still discovered by new generations, who are shocked to find that a 19th century Russian aristocrat understood human nature better than almost anyone who has written since. The books feel modern because Tolstoy's psychological insight transcends time and culture. His characters are recognizable not as Russians from the 1800s, but as people, eternal and universal. Every year, thousands of readers around the world pick up War and Peace, often intimidated by its length and reputation, and discover that it is not difficult at all, that it is in fact compulsively readable, that its 1,200 pages fly by because Tolstoy makes you care desperately about Pierre and Natasha and Prince Andrei, about their happiness and suffering, about whether they will find meaning and love. Anna Karenina continues to break hearts. The story of a woman destroyed by passion and social convention still resonates in an age when the specific conventions have changed, but the fundamental human dynamics of love, jealousy, duty, and desire remain constant. But Tolstoy's influence extends far beyond literature. His religious and political writings inspired movements for social change that are still felt today. Mahatma Gandhi read The Kingdom of God is Within You in the 1890s and found in it the intellectual foundation for his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. Gandhi's success in India inspired Martin Luther King Jr. and the American civil rights movement, which in turn inspired democratic movements around the world. The chain of influence runs directly from Tolstoy's Christian anarchism to some of the most important social transformations of the 20th century. Dorothy Day, co-founder of the Catholic worker movement, was inspired by Tolstoy's writings on Christianity and poverty. Wittgenstein read Tolstoy's Gospel in brief while serving in World War I and credited it with keeping him alive spiritually during the horror of the trenches. Countless individuals who never became famous read Tolstoy and found in his writing permission to question authority, to seek truth, to try to live according to their conscience even when it was difficult. The Tolstoy movement, the communities of people who tried to live according to his teachings, mostly faded away. Tolstoy's specific prescriptions, his vegetarianism, his peasant dress, his anarchism, these did not create a lasting movement. But his broader message, that one should seek truth fearlessly, that institutions should be questioned, that living according to one's conscience is more important than social approval, this has had immeasurable influence. In Russia, Tolstoy's estate at Yasnaya Polyana survived the revolution and was preserved as a museum. During World War II, when German forces occupied the area, the director of the museum managed to save most of Tolstoy's papers and personal effects. Today, Yasnaya Polyana receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, Russians and foreigners alike coming to see where the great writer lived and worked. The house looks much as it did in Tolstoy's time. His study, with its desk and bookshelves, is preserved. The birch groves where he walked are still there. His grave in the woods remains simple and unmarked except by the earth and trees. It is a place of pilgrimage for those who love his work or are inspired by his searching, his honesty, his refusal to accept easy answers. Tolstoy's contradictions have not been resolved by time. He was an aristocrat who tried to live like a peasant but could not quite do it. He was a Christian who rejected Christ's divinity. He was a pacifist who had served in the military. He was a moral teacher who could not live up to his own teachings. He was a man who preached love but made his wife miserable. He was a genius who declared that genius was worthless. Modern readers often struggle with these contradictions. Some dismiss Tolstoy as a hypocrite whose religious writing should be ignored. Others see his moral philosophy as invalidated by his failure to live it perfectly. But perhaps the contradictions are precisely what make Tolstoy important. He showed that it is possible to strive for ideals even while failing to reach them, that the struggle itself has meaning, that asking the right questions matters even if you cannot find all the answers. He was not a saint, and he would have rejected the label violently. He was a man, flawed and struggling, who happened to have extraordinary gifts for literature and for moral reasoning. He used those gifts to explore the deepest questions of human existence. What makes a life meaningful? How should we live? What do we owe to each other? What is the relationship between the individual and society? He did not solve these questions. No one has. But he asked them with a depth and honesty that few have matched. And he asked them not in abstract philosophical language, but through stories that make you feel the weight of the questions in your bones. When someone today picks up War and Peace and is moved by Natasha's first ball, or weeps at Prince Andrei's death, or identifies with Pierre's confused searching for meaning, Tolstoy is alive. When someone reads the Sermon on the Mount and wonders seriously what it would mean to actually live that way, Tolstoy's question is alive. When someone looks at the gap between their ideals and their actions and refuses to look away, refuses to rationalize, insists on seeing clearly even when it is painful, they are doing what Tolstoy spent his life doing. If this journey through one of the most remarkable lives in literary history has given you something to think about as you drift towards sleep, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear in the comments which of Tolstoy's works has affected you most, or how his struggles with meaning and morality resonate with your own life. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Leo Tolstoy lies in the woods at Yasnaya Polyana, beneath the earth and the birch trees, where his brother once told him a secret was buried. He searched his whole life for that secret, for the key to making all people happy. He never found it. But in searching, in refusing to stop searching even when the search brought him pain, in asking the hardest questions with absolute honesty, he left us something more valuable than answers. He left us an example of what it means to be fully human, to live with open eyes, to refuse easy comfort, to keep seeking truth even when truth is elusive and difficult and costs you everything you thought you wanted. He was the greatest novelist of his age. He was a religious seeker who never found the peace he sought. He was a man who contained multitudes and contradictions, and in his life and work we can see ourselves reflected, our own contradictions, our own yearning for meaning, our own struggle to live rightly in a world that makes rightness difficult. The green stick remains buried, if it ever existed at all. But the search continues, in everyone who reads his work, in everyone who asks his questions, in everyone who refuses to accept that life is meaningless, even when meaning is hard to find. Good night.